Which is it?
Hi, I'm Zev Elef, Associate Professor of Jewish History at Touro College and Hebrew Theological College, and today I'm with Professor Raphael Medoff. He is the founding director of the David Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies in Washington, D.C., has written over 20 books in Jewish history, and most particularly on the Holocaust and the relationship of American Jews during the Holocaust. And today I'd like to tackle a very challenging lesson in American Jewish history, that being the response of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in his understanding and his action or inaction to save 6 million Jews at the hands of the Nazis. How do you understand his legacy in the Holocaust?
Well, on the one hand, Franklin Roosevelt was the president who led America out of the Great Depression and to the brink of victory in World War II, and naturally was revered by most American Jews at the time and after the war for his overall leadership of America during those difficult times and his many accomplishments. The revelations about FDR's response to the Holocaust came much later. So during the first years after World War II and after FDR's passing, the general assumption among American Jews and the American public, whenever they thought about this issue at all, was that surely President Roosevelt had done whatever was possible to help the Jews during the Holocaust within the context of the war that was being fought. And as a result, if you look at the many biographies of FDR that were written in the 1950s and 1960s, they all reflect that sense that he did what was possible, but not much was possible. And the issue was really skipped over by most FDR scholars. The turning point, however, in the public's understanding of this issue and American Jewry's special interest in understanding the issue came in 1967 with the publication of a book called While 6 Million Died by Arthur Morse. Now, Morse was not a historian. He was an investigative journalist. As a result, the book is very readable, although it does not necessarily live up to the scholarly standards that apply when books are written by historians. Nonetheless, it's a good book and it's solid. It's just that even in 1967, Morse did not have access to many of the archives and collections that would have been relevant to writing the history of that period. Still, the book was a blockbuster. And it was, and partially because Morse was a very well-known journalist, it attracted a lot of public attention, major reviews in the mainstream American press. It was serialized in Look magazine and so forth. That was the first, that was the beginning of the change in American Jewry's perception of FDR. Scholars then followed in the years after that with major historical works that went into the archives in a way that Morse had not. So, for example, in 1968, Professor David S. Wyman, a Harvard-trained historian who taught at the University of Massachusetts, published a book called Paper Walls. The title referred to the administrative and bureaucratic obstacles that the Roosevelt administration had created in the 1930s and 1940s to suppress the immigration of Jewish refugees to the United States and to obstruct opportunities to give haven to those Jews. Wyman's groundbreaking work was then followed in 1970 by the book The Politics of Rescue by Professor Henry Feingold, which fleshed out further the story of Roosevelt's response to the Holocaust and extended it into the 1940s. Wyman's book only covered the pre-war period. Feingold went all the way through 1945. These two books, Wyman and Feingold, really set the stage then for the major historical revelations of the years that followed. In the 1970s, we had a series of additional books that went into further detail and expanded our knowledge of Roosevelt's response to the Holocaust. These were books by scholars such as Monty Penkower. And then most famously, Professor Wyman's sequel, his best-selling 1984 book, The Abandonment of the Jews, which to this day remains the gold standard in the field. Professor Wyman had access to archival collections that had not been available to any of the previous scholars, and he covered the subject in such depth and with such force that it became the book, the definitive book on the subject. And even though that was back in 1984, so that's already 36 years ago, nonetheless, no other book has surpassed it in its quality of scholarship. But also important, it was, as I said, a bestseller, meaning that a lot of people read it. It wasn't just a book that ended up on library shelves or was read by fellow historians, but rather had very wide popular appeal. And so it really, in a very substantial way, changed America's and American Jewry's perception of Roosevelt. And it really laid out and cemented the fact that there had been opportunities to rescue Jews during the Holocaust, which President Roosevelt deliberately ignored, that there had been ways to interrupt the mass murder process, for example, by bombing the railways and bridges leading to Auschwitz, and that refugee immigration had been deliberately kept far below what the law at the time allowed. These are the major findings of Wyman, following on the earlier works of Feingold, Penkower, and others, and to this day they shape the contours of any public or historians' discussions about the subject.
And so, what's interesting about FDR, and what's tragic about his relationship with American Jews and American Judaism, is that he received so much support. And part of the reluctance to accept the historical evidence about FDR has to do with his role in the Democratic Party and the Jewish vote. The Jewish vote was not squarely democratic until the emergence of FDR. How much of that political relationship played a role in the ensuing discussion over FDR's role in the war effort?
There's no doubt that the change in attitude in the American Jewish community towards FDR was to some extent generational. Those who voted for him overwhelmingly in the 1930s and 1940s, more than 90% each time, naturally had more difficulty recognizing the deep flaws of President Roosevelt with regard to the plight of European Jewry. By the 1960s, however, a new generation had grown up in the Jewish community, and significantly, the younger generation included many young activists who were rallying to the cause of Soviet Jewry and were looking at the plight of Jews in the Soviet Union through the prism of their parents' experience in the 1940s. In my interviews with former leaders of the Soviet Jewry protest movement, I found they frequently cited their perception that American Jews had not spoken out forcefully enough in the 40s as a major motivating factor for the younger generation's protests in the 1960s. And so too with the Jewish community's attitudes towards Roosevelt. What was harder for the earlier generation to swallow was not so difficult for people who were activists in the 1960s and 1970s and who were more inclined to look at the actions of the US government with a skeptical eye. In an era of Vietnam and other government policies of controversy, younger activists and younger historians were willing to look back at Roosevelt with a much more objective and often critical eye.
Is the debate settled? Are we waiting for new sources? Could more be understood about this relationship?
You know, Professor Wyman wrote in his book, The Abandonment of the Jews, that his book was not the final word on the subject, that there remained a great deal in the field to explore. And historians who have followed him have indeed expanded on our understanding of America's response to the Holocaust. And this has included important studies of American media coverage of news coming from Europe, of the responses of the American Jewish community, and of other segments of American society. But with regard to the specific question of how President Roosevelt and his administration responded to the Holocaust, it's interesting that the new information that has come out in recent years all continues to reinforce the original conclusions of Professor Wyman, Feingold, Penkower, and the others. The opportunities for rescue that were ignored, the suppression of news about the Holocaust, and so forth. So nothing that historians have found of significance since the 1980s has really altered the basic conclusions of what Professor Wyman called FDR's abandonment of the Jews. But in terms of looking at other aspects of American society, there have been many important books written in recent years. For example, Professor Stephen Norwood's study of how Ivy League American universities forged friendly relations with Nazi Germany and Nazi-controlled universities in the 1930s. And more recently, Professor Laurel Leff's two books. One, Buried by the Times, a study of how the New York Times covered or failed to cover the Holocaust. And then her most recent book, Well Worth Saving, concerning how Jewish refugee scholars could have been brought to the United States in significant numbers, but were ignored or abandoned by American universities that could have brought them, which is to say that American immigration law contained an exception for scholars. So it was possible for Jewish refugee scientists, professors, and others to come to the US outside the restrictive immigration laws. And yet American universities were almost unanimous in their disinterest in the possibility of bringing over world-renowned Jewish refugee scholars. So in these areas and in others, we've learned a great deal more about how American society has responded to news of Nazism and the Holocaust. And there are other works in progress that will shed further light on the field in the years ahead. So there is more to be written. But when we talk specifically about President Roosevelt, the new research, which appears in my books and in others, focuses somewhat more on President Roosevelt's motives as opposed to the basic facts about opportunities for rescue and the obstruction and abandonment of those opportunities. I have, for example, explored in my most recent book the question of President Roosevelt's private opinions regarding Jews and the extent to which those might have shaped his policies of keeping Jews out of America and of not wanting to interrupt the mass murder process in Europe. So that's a field which that's a subfield which raises interesting questions, and there too there is more to be said. Although in the case of FDR, historians face a somewhat more complicated task in that he was notoriously reluctant to commit his thoughts to paper. So unlike more helpful presidents, for example, like Richard Nixon, who tape recorded his Oval Office conversations, thereby providing historians with a treasure trove of insights into his private thoughts, or even President Harry Truman, who not so long ago we discovered kept a diary for part of his presidency, and that, by chance, revealed a good deal about what he thought about Jews privately. FDR didn't do that, but there are other sources in the archives. We have reliable statements from members of his cabinet and others who interacted with Roosevelt, which have shed light on what FDR thought about Jews and how that might have impacted his policy of trying to keep Jewish refugee immigration to a minimum.
Now, different history lessons carry different resonances. I imagine that when you tell these types of stories, that audiences, Jewish and non-Jewish, receive it differently.
Well, not as much as you might think, which is to say, after decades of scholarship by the historians who I've mentioned, there is a pretty broad consensus, I find, both among the general public and among Jewish audiences. There is a broad recognition of the fact that America could have done more, that President Roosevelt could have done a great deal more, and yet chose not to. Part of the reason that this issue resonates so strongly with audiences, both Jewish and non-Jewish today, is the fact that almost every American president faces the same essential dilemma that that President Roosevelt had to consider, which is whether or not to use American military force to intervene when there are human rights abuses abroad. Now, I'm framing that in the broadest terms. And I'm not talking about the immigration issue, but when, for example, we talk about the decision by the Roosevelt administration not to bomb the railways or bridges leading to Auschwitz or the gas chambers themselves, well, in subsequent generations, the genocide in Cambodia was posed a question for President Jimmy Carter, and Rwanda and the Balkans were situations of mass atrocities that the Clinton administration had to confront. Darfur was a genocide unfolding in real time during both the George W. Bush and Barack Obama administration. So, in a sense, every generation and every president at some point is faced with this question of whether or not to bomb Auschwitz, so to speak. And different presidents have responded in different ways. But that's part of the reason why both Jewish and non-Jewish audiences are still keenly interested, because the question of how FDR responded to the Holocaust is not just a historical curiosity, but rather there are lessons ultimately that can be applied to situations, to tragedies in our own times.
Thanks for clicking and learning. And here are some links to related videos. And subscribe. Don't miss out to making meaning of the past in the present for the future.